Hello, everyone. This is Alan Shimo, founder, CEO, DevOps.com, Media Ops, Container Journal. Thanks for joining us on what promises to be another great webinar today. Um, I'm actually personally really excited by this one because cloud native is something that I'm really interested in, and we've got some real cloud native experts who are going to dig in with us here, and hopefully you'll learn something by it. The webinar title, if you can't tell from the slide on your screen, is Going Cloud Native in an Uncertain World. And certainly we're living in an uncertain world in times right now, but I think we're going to get some good cloud native information. Before we begin, let me just quickly go over our GoToWebinar control panel system with you. For most of you, that GoToWebinar control panel is going to be in the right-hand corner of your screen if you're looking it on a computer or phone or what have you. And there's just a few areas that of the control panel I want to call to your attention. One is the area marked questions, and if you wouldn't mind just kind of hitting that arrow or caret so it's downward facing and expanding it, you'll see there's this place right there where you can type in your question. And the beauty of it is you don't have to worry about remembering your question for the question section. We can get to your question when the panelists think it's appropriate. And if not, it's queued. If for some reason we can't get to your question live on air, we have a record of it. We could email you answers to it. We may even choose to answer your question privately if it's not appropriate for the entire group, and we can do that in there too. So please, if you have a question, we really encourage, right? I've done probably 1,000 webinars. It's so important, that interactivity of feedback, give and take with the audience. So please put your questions in there. I also want to call your attention down to the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel, and that's the area marked chat. So here at DevOps.com Container Journal, we use the chat section if you have a technical problem. Maybe the slides aren't progressing for you, maybe you're having trouble with audio or video, any kind of technical issue, but you can still get to that chat section on your control panel. Let us know. We have people standing by, and we'll do our best to try to make this available to you, or at least try to fix it as best we can in real time. And I might as well answer always the first question, which is this webinar is being recorded and it will be available probably within a few hours of our live broadcast here today. And so worst comes to worst, you can always catch it on demand. But use the chat section for tech. Please stop popping your questions in as soon as they pop in your mind in the question section. We do have one poll question that's going to be coming up early on. And I encourage you, again, it's so important from the interactivity point of view of it. Answer the poll question. It's only going to be up a few seconds, and it's not a rocket science poll question. No one's going to fail. Just answer the question. It'll help our panelists better judge, what level they should be coming at this on, and it's an important part of it. Speaking of panelists, I'm going to introduce actually the first panelist. He'll introduce second. And then I'm going to pop out a video as not to take up more screen time, screen space, and let them have at it. So I'm going to introduce Kendall Miller. Kendall's the president of Fairwinds, our sponsor today. And thanks, Kendall and Fairwinds, for sponsoring. I'm going to hand it over to you now. You good?
I'm good. Let's go. So thanks, Alan. For everyone's sake, before we get started, we have had some internet issues this morning, so assuming it's smooth, there will be no big problems, but there may be some glitches, and maybe one of us ends up dialing in or something if there's a problem. Bear with us. As much as we live in a cloud native world, not everything tech-wise always works as planned. So as mentioned, my name's Kendall. I work for a company called Fairwinds. Fairwinds is a Kubernetes enablement company. All we do is help companies succeed with Kubernetes. So we have a managed service where we run it at scale for lots and lots of companies. We also have software and a whole bunch of open source in this space. So cloud native is all we've been doing for 5 years. That's where I live, and that's part of why I'm here. And And I asked Micah to join me. Micah is a friend. We've known each other for quite a while now. Actually, the first time that I met Micah, and I didn't tell you I was going to tell this story, Micah, but the first time I met Micah was actually on a phone call where he had just moved to New York, and I was talking to him, and he got pulled over by the police. And I heard on the phone call, the police officer saying, you can't drive and talk on the phone while you're here. And Micah was like, no, I didn't know that. I just moved to New York. And anyways, cop writes him a ticket and moves on. And Micah picks back up the phone and keeps talking. And I'm like, dude, you're still in New York. You should probably call me back when you leave the state or when you park the car. Either way, it's like, it's fine. Yeah. So anyway, so that's how I know Micah. But Micah, introduce yourself. You're the director of engineering at Soulcycle. Tell us what that means and a little bit about your background getting there.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a pretty fat ticket that I wound up not paying and cost me, I think, double. I think it was like $500 when it was all said and done. So a very memorable moment. So I took over the engineering at Soulcycle back in September. We're currently undergoing a consolidation of clouds and replatforming a lot of stuff into Kubernetes. I got into containers, man, probably 6-7 years ago at the kind of early stages of Docker. Started using it as a development tool, which I think was kind of where it really shined early on. And replacing things like Vagrant and the old virtual way of doing developer environments, and started getting into containers that way and using it for all of our dev tools. And then when I joined ADP about 5 years ago, we were just at the beginning we had kind of carved up a monolith into microservices, and we're going the Docker container route. And at the time, there were really no orchestration tools. There was no Swarm, there was no Kubernetes, there was no everything. If you wanted to deploy, I don't even think Docker Compose was like right away was available. So when you wanted to deploy containers, you were like it was all manual. You had to write your own ways of figuring out what machines to run containers on, where to go, how to monitor them. It was all very, very new, and these amazing tools didn't exist. So we went through a lot of iterations there over the last 4 or 5 years, where eventually Docker Swarm came out. So we went that route. We evaluated tools like Mesos, and Kubernetes was, I think it was either very early or still in private mode. And so we evaluated things like Mesos, and we eventually got into Docker Swarm, eventually into Docker Enterprise, and finally making the shift into Kubernetes. And it was a game changer, definitely. The ecosystem was one of the biggest factors. The ability to use all of these amazing tools really opened up a lot of opportunity for us. And we were the first group at ADP to ever do anything in the cloud. So not only were we the first to do containers, we were the first in the cloud. And that's a huge undertaking in a big enterprise like ADP, where things are traditionally run inside of a data center on premise, where everything is controlled. And going to the cloud, it changes everything. Your controls change, the way you deliver, the way you secure things. It's completely different. So part of the challenge of that was not only just figuring out containers and orchestration, but also figuring out security, controls, auditing, and doing that in the cloud for a large enterprise. So did that for a good while. Got to work on some really interesting stuff with some fantastic folks, and then joined Soulcycle back in September, and with a much smaller group of folks, and obviously kind of leading into the conversation today is going through some pretty serious economic challenges, and finding why doing this cloud native journey, and why moving into Kubernetes and replatforming is such an important undertaking, really now more than kind of any other time I've worked in tech. So that's where we're at now.
Yeah, well, and part of the reason that I can hit share results here, I'm seeing.
Yes.
So before we continue, we'll just take a look at this for the audience sake. So that sounds like about 50% of you are just getting started with a few tools in this, or just starting to think about it. the vast majority not to the leveraging cloud native technology in production space yet. So that makes sense, but we will attempt to talk to that audience at least throughout this. But again, feel free to ask questions throughout, and if we're missing something that you have in mind, we'll get to it either towards the end, or we may sneak them in as we go. But
yeah, definitely feel free to ask questions as we
that's
go.
helpful.
Conversational, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And that's helpful context, Micah. I mean, part of the reason that I wanted to do this alongside of Micah is he has run Kubernetes and implemented some of the changes to Kubernetes at a very large enterprise scale at Lithion, which is an ADP company, and then moving to Soulcycle, it's much more like a smaller startup that is a little bit more nimble. But he's also gone through the process of moving to cloud technology there, and then particularly during this time with COVID, et cetera, and how that's changed everything. So these are the topics we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to leave this slide up the entire time. This is mostly going to be a conversation between Micah and I, but we're going to work our way slowly through these different topics. So if you have other questions as we go, feel free to bring them up. But let's go ahead and dive in, and I'm going to stop sharing that screen for just a sec. So yeah, so Micah, let's start with crisis as a catalyst for tackling tech debt. We are going through a crisis right now. There's I mean, all kinds of things going on in the world, but the big one that's affecting the entire world is this virus that has made people stop going to brick and mortar stores, and for some businesses they're booming, and for some businesses they're tanking or on pause in some way. And talk about how you we'll also talk about how you thought about that at Soulcycle. What has been the business impact, as much as you're willing or can share.
Yeah, sure.
And then how have you leveraged that?
Yeah, so, and obviously it's a very common thing with companies who are brick and mortar have require people to be, whether you're a barber shop or a gym or anything that requires people to congregate into a room. The game has changed tremendously. And when I joined Soul, we were already in a place where we had we're split between multiple clouds. We were running some things in GKE, some things, Monolith on AWS, on EC2 instances. We had quite the sprawling footprint. We had some new microservices. We still had this old Monolith, and we're not a large company coming from ADP where you've got hundreds of people working on the same product and dozens of people in the DevOps place versus a DevOps and support team that's 5 to 6 people. How to understanding how can we be much more efficient in what we do. We have few people to run many services, these different platforms. So we were already looking at how do we reduce complexity? How do we reduce our footprint? So we laid out a roadmap on how we were gonna leverage cloud technologies for this. But then as COVID came, it made it very, very clear and apparent to the business that why doing this was so important. With when you've got you have a lot to manage, like all of us, I'm sure, no matter kind of what size company you are, you've got a lot of things to manage, a lot of things to operate. And when you can throw money at things, it's a little bit easier to just hire some contractors or hire this person or bring more, throw more people at it. But ultimately you just kind of continue to sprawl. And so when COVID hit, it was, and we had to unfortunately shut down for a short time all of our studios, right? Which is a big deal. And obviously we're not the only kind of company that have gone through this, but that means we have to truly do a lot more with less, right? Like we always throw that out there. You got to do more with less, and never has that been more real and true than in this time. And so that really pushed us to focus the few resources that we still had on doubling and tripling down on consolidating things into a single platform. This is one of the things I've always seen as the benefit of Kubernetes is you have a single, it's like a new operating system, right? Like you have one operating model to rule them all. You can leverage it to provision cloud resources. You can use it as you have a single deployment mechanism for all of your applications. you don't have to learn, tons of different, I mean, obviously there's a learning curve in and of itself in the ecosystem, but typically you've got to figure out how you're deploying to EC2 instance, how are you going to deploy to, all these other kinds of things. And the Kubernetes operating model really gives you a lot more controls and ability to consolidate things into one operating model, which is essentially you have YAML and you have a cluster and you deploy this YAML to that cluster. End of story, right? And so being able to kind of reduce these complex systems and all of these different ways of doing things into a much more simple model allows us to operate this at a much bigger scale with much fewer people. And
Micah, let me interrupt you there. So we need to come back to much bigger scale with much fewer people. But when you're talking about Kubernetes, I mean, you've tried the other technologies that sort of predated it, right? And even probably far enough back where you were trying to write your own orchestration tool, which is something I'm familiar with. It's something we did before Kubernetes came along. We went out and wrote an orchestration tool to simplify through, to simplify deployments and scaling and all of that. And talk about, like, why did you land on Kubernetes? Because I think the reason I asked this question, I think a lot of people in particular look at Kubernetes and they're intimidated by it. It's big,
of course.
It's hairy, it's completely new, it's a whole different paradigm, right? But compared to building an orchestration system yourself or some of the other orchestration systems that were out there, it seems easy and understandable and graspable. So talk a little bit about your background and how you ended up with this.
Yeah, it is kind of like one of these things where it's very relative. Like going from not knowing any containers or containerization or what orchestration, what really is involved in that, and jumping into something like Kubernetes can definitely seem daunting because there's a lot of building blocks you have to learn along the way. But and that was really why it was so apparent to us when we saw really how Kubernetes worked, why it was so powerful to us. But backing up a bit, when we first had the idea, like we were gonna, and previously when I had been in other places, like I said, we only use containers for development as a development tool. And actually, even Docker then was like, do not use containers in production. They're not ready for production workloads to serve traffic. And then jumping into ADP, where we're like, hey, we've got this monolith we just carved up into about 12 microservices, and we want to run them in production, but we also everything is containers, so we also want to run MySQL databases in containers. We want to run, everything as a container. The whole idea of like persistent data, and there's lots of challenges with that. So we started by having to figure out, like, how do we decide what machines, if we have a fleet of machines, how do we decide which containers go to which ones, and what happens if they crash, and what happens if they don't? And at the time, so what we started with was very simple, like, okay, we have these machines that are going to run these 3 containers, these ones that are going to run those, and we used Ansible, and Ansible would run very basic Docker run commands, but that doesn't solve the problem of, Docker at the time had no really resiliency built in. There was nothing, there was no health checks, there was, none of that in the ecosystem. So you were writing a lot of those kinds of things yourself. You had to then there were some open source tools that started to come out, like Registrator and Console, because then the other problem was, like, how do you figure out if I'm one container and I need to talk to these others, how do I know what machine they're running on? So the whole service discovery aspect. And I know, like, a lot of people take these things for granted now, but that's because the ecosystem has evolved so much further. But trying to solve all these problems at the time was just a lot of custom stuff that had to be done. And as we went, and then you kind of get a basic setup, but then you have to start thinking about, how do we build in resiliency? How do we operate this? And now how do we scale, right? Like, so now today we had 12 microservices. That quickly became 50, right? How on earth do you deploy 50 different services, scale them all independently, and correlate that to what machines are they running on, and what happens, let alone when a container fails, what happens when an EC2 instance fails? And then you get into, we were running at the time, I'd mentioned, like, security constraints and trying to operate the cloud like a data center. ADP had to really, our security org had to really kind of shift their way of thinking about, how do we not only do containers, but then also how do we do cloud that, outside of this data center where we control everything. So things that were off limits to us at the time were like, we couldn't use RDS, we couldn't use any of the kind of cloud native ecosystem. We could only use bare EC2 instances. So as part of this, we're also thinking like, okay, if we're running MySQL on a host, how do we, that's running in a Docker container, what do we do about volumes? And what happens if this container, we want this ephemerality of the container itself, but we have this persistent concept with data. And there was no mechanism for like, listen, if you lost that node, you're hosed. Hopefully you had a backup and, you can go through the MySQL restore process.
Yeah.
So, containers in and of themselves are just this magical thing. There's so much that goes into the surrounding pieces that make it, a system that you can operate and run in production.
Well, and that's I think the reason this is such important technology is, you touched on, you had to manage specific instances in AWS as though they're your servers in a data center, right? So how are you doing that? Well, you're picking a certain number of machines or instances and treating them like they're persistent machines and saying, I'm going to use a tool like Ansible to make sure that I orchestrate these machines always run this service. If one of these machines go down, I replace it with another one. And that's because even the internal DNS, so that services can talk to each other, is a complicated problem. And scaling is a complicated problem. And well, so let me finish.
We had the concept.
Question.
Okay, go ahead.
So then with Kubernetes, you have this API that makes sense out of all this. And internally, it processes DNS. It processes scaling. It figures out how to, spin up a container, spin down one, so that you don't have to write all that logic from scratch. And that's what's giving you this significant lever in this time of crisis where you have to manage more with less, is it's an API that makes sense, that's backed by the community. And yes, it's a paradigm shift, but once your people learn that paradigm, you're able to do way more. I mean, is that an accurate representation?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Pardon me while this phone gets answered and hung up on really quickly. So yeah, absolutely. The lift that you get out of with Kubernetes in this case is that it solves all of those really big challenging pieces, which I think most people, when they kind of venture into this space, don't realize how much all of those, how critical all of those pieces are. And really, in a lot of ways now, we kind of take those things for granted because now we can all we have to focus on is our application, right? Like that's always the goal with DevOps and all this stuff, is how do we strip away all of the operational complexity and things and really focus on delivering business value, which is the actual services that are running, that are providing, features to our customers. And prior to the containers and prior to then Kubernetes is it takes a lot of people and a lot of manpower and a lot of resources to coordinate and do all of these things. And now, we finally have an automated system that solves like 85 to 90% of those challenges, and lets us get back to focusing on delivering business value, which is why and how we all get paid, right?
But it's a huge paradigm shift. If you're used to managing servers, you're used to updating servers, you're used to making sure all the servers are the same. Absolutely. Suddenly, the paradigm shift of I'm going to make a container and I'm going to hand the container off is just this huge. It's a change, and I liken it a lot of times to if Windows is all you've ever used your whole life, moving to Linux is a really big shock. It's a really big change at the beginning. Once you learn Linux, especially as a developer, very few people go back to Windows because there's a lot of things about it that are really, really nice from a developer's perspective. And I think it's a similar thing in this. Well, so you touched a little bit on that migration from monolith to containers with Kubernetes. And I want to hear a little bit about, you're in this time crunch trying to make the most out of COVID. And, how do you do this in a time crunch? I mean, migrations, replatforming is always painful, but now it's like, we got to move fast. Let's get all this up before everything reopens is part of the push, I imagine. I mean, I'm guessing that. But talk about the time crunch aspect.
Yeah, that's definitely tough. And so one answer is always you work more hours, but uh, really the best kind of advice around there is, in my view, is don't try to do too many things at one time, right? Really, obviously you want to move over, but be willing to do it in a not so perfect way, right? Like, don't try to solve all the problems before you actually encounter them, and make sure everything is like fully automated. And I can't move this application if I don't have 1,000% of all my automation, 100, all things completely automated. Like, don't be afraid to you can't be afraid because you don't have the time to do things that necessarily operationally don't scale right away, but so that way you can get the lift of getting things moved over. We've had to make lots of concessions along the way. Like, we know that once we have things running in Kubernetes and we have at least a single operating model where we're not trying to do all these manual deploys to these monolithic servers behind these manually created resources and load balancers. And I think the band came. So it wouldn't be COVID. It wouldn't be COVID if there wasn't some sort of interruption during all this. So it's really about I think really understanding where the real benefit is that you're trying to accomplish, and being able to just kind of whittle it down to the most important things, and not try to boil the ocean and solve all the world's problems at once. Because once you get into the applications deployed and running in Kubernetes, it's that right there is, I think, probably 90% of the battle. And then
and so what if did you prioritize certain applications? And I imagine it's not all about like, probably you're not moving your database into Kubernetes as the highest priority, if ever. Like you're picking a few applications to migrate in, or you're breaking up a monolith and picking a few of the high priority things, maybe the things that really need to scale, or you really want your spend to match your usage. Are those some of the higher priorities, or how did you think about what?
That's kind of how we looked at it. One was we looked at actually the first things we did. So we looked at it a few different ways and talked about, do we take the most complex thing and move that first, which would allow us to try to solve all the hardest problems ahead of time, or do we look for some easy wins and take the smallest, the easiest applications, and then just move those to get some experience under our belt, right? It's kind of a trade-off. So we kind of started with, at first we started with taking our most complicated system and looking, because we also know that, like, this is the one that's delivering the most business value. It's the one it's our bread and butter, right? And it was going to force us into solving a lot of the most complex problems. But also we were under time constraints. We had a reduced resources to work with. So we then shifted it into things that would be quicker wins, and I think it was actually the right approach, because then it gave all of the team as a whole more experience and more comfort with doing some of the basics, right? Like, how do we just get an easy application up and running? We don't have to solve all of the most complex problems and still get value. So if I did it again, I would do it the same way again. I would some of the challenging parts are really understanding, like, how do we operate a cluster? Because Kubernetes doesn't completely free you from any operational complexity at all. It certainly shifts it. It just shifts the challenges to a much more manageable set, right?
Sure.
And so the first phase was, let's get what's a right way to deploy Kubernetes. And so at Soul, we're on EKS. And so obviously I would highly recommend, if at all possible, any managed Kubernetes is definitely hands down the best route to go, if at all possible. And especially for small teams, few resources, you don't want to be having to manage your own control plane. Having someone else do that is fantastic. But so once we kind of got the understanding of, like, how to run the cluster, how to, get some good metrics around what we were doing, and some observability things put in place, then it was like, now we can we started moving the simpler applications, which everything sounds simpler, but you always hit some sort of complexity.
There's always a level of complexity. Yeah. Well, so some of the things I heard: leverage the cloud's managed offering. I mean, Amazon has EKS, Google has GKE, Azure has AKS. If you're gonna, for historical context too, just so everyone knows, a significant part of the work that Fairwinds used to do was just standing up a cluster, because 2 years ago it was really hard to just stand up a cluster. And now with these managed service offerings, it's not hard. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Leverage the managed service is some of your first advice. And the next thing is, don't necessarily start with the biggest, hairiest application that's most mission critical. Start with some of the low hanging fruit that's relatively easy. Everything's relative. Everything's hard. But if you start with that, people start to learn the new paradigms. They get comfortable with it. They're not freaking out that the whole thing is going to cave in as the initial thing starts, right?
Yeah, and then because also, you're going to learn like how do I make those applications resilient to failures? Like you do get a lot of things out of the box with Kubernetes for sure, but there are also additional signals that you're going to want to track and alert around and handle, and moving your most business valuable piece is going to be all the most risk for when as you're learning like how to handle things because things go wrong, like without a doubt. Like we live in the cloud and things are going to happen, and so definitely get as much of those learnings and some of the things that aren't as mission critical ahead of time, and build up your team and your experience. Or if you're a small company and you have obviously some great you're able to pull in some consultants or get some guidance from some folks that I would definitely highly recommend pulling in, especially if you want to go fast, pulling in professionals who have encountered a lot of the things before in this ecosystem and understand, like, because sometimes like even just figuring out the right, how do we do CI/CD in Kubernetes, right? Like understanding it, there's a bazillion options, and and figuring out like, okay, if we use Helm, where do we store the Helm chart? Where do we, is it decentralized? You're going to have all of those questions along the way. So I can't tell you enough, like how important it is to just have the conversation, be able to, having that conversation with people who've done it, to bounce the ideas off of and understand the pros and cons. Like that was one thing at ADP, we went round and round and round, like for months over, because we're also talking like we have to do this for hundreds of applications and hundreds of developers, and these things like if you get it wrong, you're paying a bigger operational tax, right?
Well, so give me a few examples of some of the tools you landed on, and folks, just so you know, where I'm going to aim to wrap up around 11:40 or around 45 past the hour or so that we have time for questions. So please, dump your questions in there as you have them. But yeah, Micah, go back and talk about. I mean, I can talk about some of the default tooling we use, but what did you land on for CI/CD? What did you land on for some of the other things? Talk about some of the tooling that worked for you.
Yeah. So and I don't want it to say, I certainly sound sales pitchy at all, but like I've used and tried a lot of different open source tools. We've done custom Jenkins stuff, and I can't say enough things about. So and we also tried Spinnaker for a really long time. But when I joined Soul, they had already had Harness in place, and I didn't like it. It was felt kind of janky and weird to use. But I see now the reason why was because it kind of forced me to change my view on how deployments are supposed to work. So a tool like Harness and a tool like Spinnaker have a kind of different mentality around, or a different process for deployments, and it takes you a little bit to kind of wrap your head around it. But once I kind of dove in and really understood the tool, I'm a huge fan of it. I still have people on our team who are big fans of Jenkins X and custom Jenkins and other things, but we are using Helm with Harness. It's a fantastic tool. Obviously, it's not open source, so if I were to do another open source version, it would probably be Spinnaker. But Spinnaker has a lot of challenges around just running. Spinnaker takes like an entire team, getting it up and running and maintaining it. So like if you have the opportunity, you have, obviously money is tight, obviously for a lot of people, but if you have the opportunity to get a tool like that, I would highly recommend it. I spend a lot of time trying to get the GitOps model with Flux and with Argo up and running and working, and those are really cool tools and great paradigms. But there's a lot of other things that have to go into making that a successful production ready way of deploying things. Like GitOps is the big buzzword, and I like it in theory, but I have yet to really kind of see it work without a whole lot of other tooling and ecosystem around it. So
Yeah.
you know, Helm for us has been great, whether you use it just for templating or whether you're using Helm 3 to deploy. That's what we're using. It works good, I think, for the 90% use case. So I'm very happy with that.
Well,
I would highly recommend. Go ahead.
Well, so I mean, I would say you touched on a couple different things there. That, like, first of all, there are a million different tools, and I would encourage people, be careful about what you read, where you get your information, because there's the vast majority of the internet is two ends of the spectrum. You have the Netflix that has deployed things with Spinnaker, and Spinnaker is an amazing tool if you're Netflix, and it's the right tool for almost no one else. I mean, unless you're at just incredible skill, it is so much overhead and not worth it. And there's some simple things. You save a lot of operational overhead by using a SaaS tool. So we point a lot of customers at Circle CI for its simplicity. Are there more complex tools? Are there more tweakable tools? Yes. If you need to self-host it, Jenkins is a great tool. GitLab is an amazing tool that integrates all the different things. There's lots of options, but go with one of the middle of the road ones. There's the world on the internet that's the Netflix is saying, here's how we solve the world's biggest problem. You probably don't have the world's biggest problem. The other side of the internet is the people who are like, I've run Kubernetes on 3 Raspberry Pis. I know all the answers. Here's all the answers. And you're also not running Kubernetes on 3 Raspberry Pis. You need to run it in production at some meaningful scale that's probably not Netflix.
Absolutely.
And finding the information in the middle is really hard. Go ahead, Micah.
So I think two things there. I think one is the internet, it has so much information. It's really, when you're coming into these new systems, it's hard to distill down what's really valuable and what's not, because it just depends on which blog you read and what companies are promoting, what things, or what people are saying on Twitter. But like it's really, I think one of the biggest challenges is being able to really speak with someone who has the experience, because the experience that we gained at ADP going through this was because we had to live through it. We had no other choice. And after coming out of that, like, I would speed things up so much more. If I could just have a conversation with you, it would be more worth spending a few dollars up front having a conversation with someone like you who has done it, just to kind of distill down, all of the noise. And that I think trying to we have these great tools and we have all these open source things, but I think as engineers we love to look at companies that have solved these big complex problems and think of ourselves in the same way, but it's really doesn't really apply. So Spinnaker is one of those examples.
Yeah, well, and I'm gonna take that minute to pitch. This is saved for the end, but if you want to go dig around for best practices, Fairwinds, our company, has a white paper. It touches on security, efficiency, reliability, all those different things. So this is, you can check it out on fairwinds.com, look for the Kubernetes best practices white paper. This will save you a lot of headache. We have learned a lot of lessons the hard way, and I strongly encourage you to learn from us instead of reinvent the wheel. But that said, and particularly on the security side, let's wrap up here a little bit. Well, I want to get back to, we've got 2 more questions, but let's talk briefly about security and how you think about security, Micah, in the cloud native world. It's different securing a server than it is securing an entire virtual private cloud in Amazon and running Kubernetes in it. Talk about how you, like, just what are some of the first things people need to think about on the security side?
Yeah, it's kind of it's tough when you've at a place like ADP too, where everything has been in a data center. You're going from where not only do you control the perimeter, you control everything inside of it. Like there's it's just a completely different set of challenges. You in the cloud, I would say, like, the biggest advice, if I could go back and give it again, was to and it applies to kind of all DevOps kind of aspects and being in cloud and cloud native is really like when you drink if you just drink the Kool-Aid of the things that they provide out of the box, you can get a lot further than trying to reinvent how you do things in the data center with how you do it in the cloud. It's there's a lot of great tools, like specifically like there's some things you can lots of tools, open source tools that will you can run it against your cloud environment and get information about where your vulnerabilities are without ever having to run like pen tests and kind of all those things, just by looking at your configuration. And that's the other advantage here too, is like the APIs and all the things that are built around these cloud providers give you. There's a lot of great tools that you can just point at and get some like very quick wins on like where's some of your biggest gaps and monitoring things. Even in Kubernetes clusters, being able to run tools that you will inspect your cluster and tell you, hey, you've got some vulnerabilities here, or here's some big gaps that you need to go upgrade, or what we've been really focused on too is like not from a security perspective, but from a cost perspective. Like, how do we, as we move in things into Kubernetes, how do we measure what these applications are costing us to run, right? So this is another big space where some interesting products are coming out to help you identify like what it, now that we're in this containerized world, how much are we really paying for these things? So
sure. Well, so yeah, I mean, you did. There was a lot there. Last question before we get to the questions that people are asking. Why isn't the cloud just another data center? Talk a little bit about that. Like, what's fundamentally different about it, and how do you need to think about it differently?
It's fundamentally different in a number of ways, but you're on. I mean, look, you're on shared hardware, you're on shared everything. Where your data center is something you fully control, every aspect of it. Whereas if you're running in AWS, you're. I mean, they've done a lot better job of isolating things, but you have to. You're certainly a lot more vulnerable. But I think I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, but it's leveraging the tools that are built by in the cloud to versus trying to take the tools that you are using in your data center. Everything from like networking. One of the big challenges we had moving into the cloud from the data center mindset was like, we will just go and do networking exactly the same way in the cloud, and we're just going to make the cloud an extension of our in-house data center. That just provides, having that mindset going into it really forces you to jump through so many hoops and really use the cloud in a way that it was never intended. So it's best to really just treat it as what it is, and operate it as a cloud, and not just like, hey, everything in the data center, we're gonna move it over here. We set up like so much extensive DNS and routing and all these things I say we, but just like ADP as a whole, when we started to move into the cloud, and it didn't actually provide any value to. It actually didn't provide any additional security. It forced all of the engineering to jump through way more hoops to get some of the most basic things done, and which slowed everything down from actually providing any business value. So it was actually a net negative on how things were done. So I just couldn't advise more to really just treat it as, use the tools that it is, and as its own entity.
Yeah, it is a fundamental different shift. So the data center is a building that you can walk around in, running physical hardware that you can touch and feel, and there's a significant amount of data center operations where you're literally walking across the floor and flipping a machine off and flipping it back on because you're trying to solve a certain problem. And the cloud is built to be fundamentally different, to only interact with it via APIs. And you never know if you're on a single machine, if you're spread across 15 machines, if you're sharing one machine with 200 people, and you don't even care, frankly. But that is a completely different world. You cannot shut off a machine and turn it back on physically. you have to interact with it in order to flip those things through. And so that's the foundation for why everything's different. You have a long running machine in your data center that a lot of operators are trying to never let shut down. They're literally like, uptime on this machine's 12 years and 14 days. This is amazing, right? Whereas in the cloud, it's Amazon is going to at some point shut off your instance. And if you're planning on that instance running forever, you're in trouble. So everything is ephemeral from the ground up, and that's the fundamental shift in cloud.
And I'll say, to that point, I would say one of the things that we talk about ephemerality and containers is, back before, where you're kind of having to manage nodes yourself, we had the whole pet versus cattle concept of like, pets are the things that you love and you monitor, and cattle are just things that can come up and, are much more ephemeral. And when we first got into containers, it's like the containers themselves were ephemeral, but all the nodes we managed were not. And so we didn't really get the full ephemerality that we wanted until, fully having systems like Kubernetes where it's resilient enough that if nodes go down, it doesn't matter because it's all cattle.
Yeah. Okay, so we're out of time for the main presentation. We've got a couple questions in here. I'm gonna bring them up and read through them, and we'll go from there. So the first question, Micah, is why are you using Kubernetes instead of functions as a service? Why not use functions as a service over Kubernetes? Doesn't that make life way easier? Talk about that.
Yeah, so we do use some functions as a service, and really, for me, I view Kubernetes as it's an ecosystem. Functions as a service is running one service of one thing. There's still a lot of automation that needs to go into creating that function of service. You got your cloud formation, you got this, you got how do you do deployments, how do you connect things into it. It's certainly handy because you're not managing the server, but with Kubernetes, I mean, for the most part. In most hosted solutions, you don't have to necessarily manage the servers, but you get a whole ecosystem of tools that make both deploying and building and running applications. You still have to figure out service discovery, like if you have multiple functions of service, how do they talk to each other? How do so there's a lot more that just goes into it than just turning a thing on and running it. And it's the ecosystem of Kubernetes and the community, to me, where the value comes.
Yeah, so I mean, I would add a couple different things to this. First of all, I believe that the entire world is shifting to Kubernetes. We're seeing that shift in the same way that we saw servers shift to Linux. Now, when you go leverage Lambda on AWS, I don't know what's underneath, but my guess is it's something like Kubernetes. And in the future, even the functions as a service things are just going to be leveraging Kubernetes underneath. So it's going to be the foundation for everything. Are there reasons to use functions as a service over Kubernetes? Absolutely. And I know of a number of organizations who have a very, very simple backend. It's basically a single server that needs to process something. Making that a function as a service, so you don't have to worry about deploying into it. Those kinds of things are managing all the different pieces, setting up namespaces, et cetera. There's a lot of complexity to Kubernetes that functions as a service obscures away. Now, there's a certain level of complexity that some companies need where functions as a service is no longer sufficient. And there are specific problems too still with functions as a service, such as the cold start issue. Sometimes cold start takes way too long. If you're scaling at some certain speed or pace, sometimes functions as a service get overrun. But the other option is go ahead.
Yeah, so the other thing I would say is that functions as a service are great, again, if you have a kind of a simple thing, but typically organizations don't have applications that just run one kind of way, right? Like you have usually lots of different applications that need to run, and Kubernetes gives you that. It's really an operating model that can handle a lot of those scenarios, and running your function as a service could just be one of them. I mean, it has cron jobs, it has lots of other bits to it that, again, if you're doing something that simple, fine. But you could also, if you have to run other things and you need a way to run these other things, then why not have one operating model to rule them all, in my view?
Yeah, I would also add, finally, like functions as a service can be expensive on certain clouds. So depending on what your workloads need to look like, sometimes you get priced out of functions as a service. You can run functions as a service on top of Kubernetes. Think Knative. There's a number of different tools out there that do it. But then, finally, like I think that the reason the vast majority of companies use something like Kubernetes is it's a quote I regularly draw on from Kelsey Hightower, who's a principal engineer at Google, who said, everyone wants a platform as a service. They just want the one that's customized to meet their needs. And Kubernetes today is the closest thing we have to a platform as a service framework. So it builds you a custom PaaS that's going to meet your needs. And usually, as a company, if you can interact with a PaaS that is custom built for you, you're going to be in a good spot. So that's why a lot of people use Kubernetes. Some companies, there's going to be great reasons to use it. I think of functions as a service as one more tool in your tool belt, like Micah mentioned. Let's move on to the next one. I'm working on an age-old ERP, BAAN, BAN. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. I don't know BAN specifically, but I did look it up when this question was asked. And I'm running it on premise. How can cloud-native tools help if I migrate? Do you want to take that one, Micah, or do you want me to?
I mean, if you want to take it, it's fine. I mean, it's the same no matter what you're running on premise. First of all, like the toughest process is understanding, is step one is containerizing it, right? And I think even whether you're running that on-prem or in the cloud, like that's step one, and that's where you're going to get a huge value out of, right? Like I'm not sure what your deployment process is, but I imagine it's probably as archaic as the ERP system is that you're operating. And it's just being able to have that ephemerality, being able to run the same thing locally that you run in production is going to be huge, whether you're running in the cloud or on-prem.
Yeah, I would say all those things. My only warning would be, if this is an age-old tool, it's likely built to run on a machine that will never shut off, and it can't be ephemeral. And if it can't be ephemeral, don't put it in the cloud, because the cloud is, by its very nature, ephemeral. Even when we build environments, we build ephemerality into it all the way down to the cluster level. We want to be able to tear down a Kubernetes cluster and stand one back up, because everything in the cloud is ephemeral, unless it's a database, which I should be careful about. But there's ways to handle those things in long-running states.
Yeah,
now
we have a lot of questions around how that data in that ERP is stored and all of those things. Like it doesn't even have the separation between the data store and the application that you're interacting with itself. So there's a I guess the real answer to the question is it depends.
Yeah, and sometimes you can just lift and shift it and drop it in the cloud and run it like you would in your data center, and maybe that's the best thing to do in this, so you don't have to worry about your data center. And I know that a few years ago, Google Cloud was the only one that has this. I imagine the other clouds have something similar now, but they had a live migration option where even if an instance is going to be shut down, Google will migrate that to a new instance so that it doesn't ever shut off. So I know that that kind of technology does exist, at least with Google. I assume that Amazon has something similar, but it's not. I don't worry about things that run long term because that's not the technology that I work with. Okay, let's move on to the next one. How do you fact check what is considered truthful materials on the internet? So I think that this question is basically asking what I touched on. There's the world of Netflixes and there's the world of people who've run it on a Raspberry Pi and think they have all the answers. How do you find the useful information? Well,
check Twitter.
Well, Mike, you start with that. You go to Twitter, is that what you said?
Yeah, because everything on Twitter is usually truthful and whatnot. So no, I think really the best option is like talking with people who have experience in that space or trying it out yourself. And there's no shortcut to experience, right? That's the truth in all things in life. And if fortunately though in tech we have have people who've been there, built it, done that, and if you have somebody like that you can reach out to and talk to, you will get so much farther in a shorter period of time. Not to say that you can completely circumvent ever gaining some of that experience yourself to where you really know it in and out, but it's definitely a good way to get started.
Yeah, and I would say finding the people that you believe you can trust. They come from reputable companies. They have put out information. Fairwinds, we have an offering where we call it advisory, where companies just pay us to be able to ask us questions because they don't want to be Googling and wondering, is this the right thing to do? And it's a support that comes from our engineers that are very, very seasoned. You want to ask questions, you can ask questions. So if you're willing to pay for it, you can make that problem go away. If you want to Google around and guess, your best options are to lean on the companies that are well respected in the space, the blog posts that they post that are highly technical, those kinds of things. We also have a number of blog posts, a number of free resources. We also have a whole bunch of open source tooling that is free and available that will help you do a lot of these things well. But how do you fact check what is considered truthful on the internet? That is an age-old question that's not going to go away anytime soon. And isn't just relevant to Kubernetes. But
yeah, and I mean, and also, you know, follow me on Twitter and feel free to DM me or LinkedIn or whatever. And I'm always happy to, you know, at least just have some cursory conversations and, you know, just get the ball rolling for you.
Yeah, and I'll put that slide back up that has Micah's and my Twitter. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. We'll try to be useful. And then we want to leave a minute or two to wrap up here at the end to Alan, but a couple more questions. First of all, Ashok asks, I believe that the cloud provider takes care of security and patching if you use serverless or K8s. No, like, first of all, like, yes, they solve some of that. A number of the cloud providers do have upgrades that are automated, or you can click a button and upgrade, but do not leave security to the cloud provider. There are lots and lots and lots of ways to leave your information exposed and open to the internet. Just because you're running it on a cloud does not mean it's secure. The like canonical example is an S3 bucket that has no security on it and has all of the company's information open to the public, and anyone can hit that IP address and see everything that's there. What's that?
I'm pretty sure that's never happened.
I'm pretty sure that's never happened. That's right. So security, our Kubernetes best practices thing has a whole section on security. I'm also going to take the second to plug. Fairwinds has a product. If you're running Kubernetes, it's called Fairwinds Insights. It will expose security problems. It will expose best practices, and it will give you tools for, well, remediation steps so that you can go fix those. So you don't have to be an expert in it to know how to fix it. We're going to expose what's wrong and also tell you how to fix it. It's a software solution. It's free up to a certain size. It's Fairwinds Insights. If you go to fairwinds.com/insights, you can check that out, and that can help you with a lot of those things. Okay, all of a sudden a whole bunch more questions, but we're going to answer one more and then probably wrap up. Should we run databases, stateful sets, workloads on K8s versus the database on an IaaS or database as a service? Micah?
I would say that my canned answer would primarily always be like choose a hosted service. You certainly can do it, but why? Unless you have some real, you know, special use case, I would definitely advise against it. I mean, Kubernetes has come a long way with being able to run stateful applications. And it's, you know, it's from the days, especially from the days where I had to manage it manually. But I would just ask the question as to why you think you need to do that. You're not going to save, you know, money, or even if it is, it's not worth the headache and all of this stuff that goes, you know, trying to build a resilient system around that is, you know, a lot of companies have spent a lot of years trying to do it right. And certainly there are some tools that help, but I would hands down advise against it 98% of the time.
Kubernetes has the ability to attach a stateful set. You can run a database inside of Kubernetes. There are certain situations where that makes sense to have some kind of long living data live in your cluster. For everything else, there's RDS, there's Cloud SQL, there's other database as a service tools. If you run the database in your Kubernetes cluster, you have to figure out backups. You have to figure out you know, when the cluster comes down, how to detach it from your cluster, attach it to the new cluster. There's going to be latency issues. You're going to have race conditions.
Is that, you know, perhaps you're running you need a data store that is not available like that, like maybe like an etcd or a Vault or, you know, something like that. And there are some really fantastic tools and operators, if you're familiar with the, you know, look into the operator pattern in Kubernetes, and there's some great operators that help you do things like you can find them to run MySQL and other things, but if specifically if there's a data store that you have to use that isn't available like that, look into the operators that build all of that operational things into Kubernetes itself for that particular database.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Micah. I appreciate making the time. And Alan, I don't know if you want to pop back on and do something else, but everyone else.
Hey, first of all, both Kendall and Micah, thanks a lot, man. I know, working from home and internet issues, some of the audio popped in and out. Hopefully it'll come out well in the recording. But, it's invaluable information. We're all dealing with Kubernetes and cloud native. And Micah, you had some great points. I wanted to chime in, but I wanted to let you guys kind of take it. Open source and the whole cloud native thing's rocking. But we got to end real quick. Our Amazon winners: Chris B, Fred D, Jackie N, Mark C, Mary M, and Judy K. Congratulations. Our people will be getting some Amazon cards out to you. Hey, many thanks to Fairwinds for sponsoring and Kendall and Micah allowing us to borrow your brains a little bit today. Maybe we'll come back and do some.
I will just make one last plug. If you need help with Kubernetes, we have services and software that can help you with it. We're an enablement company. So thanks.
Fairwinds. What's the website, Kendall?
Fairwinds.com.
That's what I wanted to hear. Last word. Hey, be well, everyone. We'll see you on another video soon. Bye-bye.